The GTX 750 Ti is a bit of a weird card. It's a 700 series graphics card, yet it basically shares nothing with the rest of the 700 series. That is because they are mainly Kepler, whereas this is based on Maxwell. And as from what we know, Maxwell is the architecture for the 900 series, which this is more closely related to in a way. This is because this is Maxwell 1.0, whereas most of the 900 series is Maxwell 2.0. Those graphics cards do support DirectX 12 at a feature level, whereas this, no, it doesn't. But because it's Maxwell and not Kepler, it's still supported by Nvidia, which means you can install the latest game-ready drivers on the 750 Ti. So yeah, this graphics card's still supported for whatever reason. But for the sake of nostalgia and the £18 I paid for this graphics card, it really wasn't that expensive at all. I want to see how it gets on, and to do so I've tested it at 1080p, and I've also used FSR in some titles, as yeah, you do kind of need it. FSR today has been used on balance, and it has been said when done so. All testing has been done in my testing PC, which has a Ryzen 5 7600, 32GB of 6000 CR36 DDR5 memory, a Western Digital SN770 2TB NVMe SSD. All of this is attached to the X670E Tomahawk from MSI. All testing has been done on the latest Nvidia Game Ready driver, as the 750 Ti does support it, which is 55599. See, I've remembered the Nvidia driver again, and I've done a slight overclock to both the core and the memory just to give this GPU a little bit of a fighting hand. Without any more being said, let's get straight into it. Starting off with a game which would kind of make sense on a 750 Ti, and that is Fortnite set to the Performance API, because here you're getting more than 200 frames per second on average, and the 1% low is also looking somewhat decent as well at 110 frames per second. Because of this, if you've got a 750 Ti and you want to get into some competitive Fortnite Battle Royale, it's certainly a possibility, and I don't see you having any problems with this GPU in Fortnite on the Performance API. Where you'll be running into problems though is Cyberpunk 2077, because at native 1080p, man, the performance is not very good at all. 22 FPS on average with 16 frames per second for the 1% low is not playable performance at all, and this is on a custom low preset where everything has been manually set to low, and it's still not very playable at all. To get to a somewhat playable frame rate, you will need to enable FSR on balance, and here 33 frames per second on average with 26 FPS for that 1% low means it is running slightly better. Then again, the visual quality has been absolutely butchered by FSR, and 33 frames per second with totally low settings, it isn't particularly brilliant. Unlike the rest of the 700 series, the 750 Ti can launch and play F1 23, but with 52 FPS for a racing game, it's not that playable. To get it to be playable though, enabling FSR on balance does see the frame rate go above 60 frames per second on average, and that 1% low is also looking very good, close to the average. So it is fairly playable, but in racing games, you want at least more frames than this. At least I know I would, but if you've got a 750 Ti, you kind of have to take what you can get, to be honest. Rainbow Six Siege is kind of a letdown on the 750 Ti, because at 1080p with the very low preset, we didn't even manage to get into the triple digits today. This is kind of a shame, but in all fairness, the 750 Ti did put out a smooth frame rate, as the 1% low was at 79 frames per second. So if you really wanted to get competitive into Rainbow Six Siege, I don't recommend a 750 Ti for it, because in a game like this you ideally want around at least 120 frames per second, because being a first person shooter and that. You could argue a case for Counter-Strike 2, because 123 frames per second on average with 85 FPS for the 1% low means this game is actually decently playable. This frame rate, it would probably be fine for me if I were playing, and as long as you're not in a PGL major or anything like that, 123 frames per second on average is totally fine. This was taken in a deathmatch with bots, so if you were playing competitive, I would wager you'd get a higher frame rate, as it's less taxing on the hardware. And finally, the last game up today is Skyrim Special Edition. Setting it to the medium preset here for this 2016 sort of remaster of this title sees a decent frame rate, getting just below that locked 60 FPS. And the 1% low was not particularly brilliant at 40 frames per second, but I have to say the game did feel smooth enough and it wasn't hitching or anything like that. It's just a Bethesda engine moment. So if you wanted to play Skyrim on a 750 Ti, it's certainly doable, and to be honest, if you were to install some mods to optimise this title up a bit, that would get the performance looking pretty nice. So overall, in terms of modern gaming performance, particularly with AAA titles, this little entry graphics card from a decade ago can't really do that much. But to be fair, this is what I was totally expecting, because it's a 750 Ti, this thing was entry level 10 years ago, and I only paid just £18 for it. So if you take all that into account, the fact that it can even slightly run Cyberpunk is kind of a win for it, I guess. But if we take a look at the overall performance, I'm going to start off with the bad, because newer AAA games, they can't really run on this graphics card because the performance just isn't there, and you will need to enable FSR on balanced to get 30 frames per second in a game like Cyberpunk. This is not a great gaming performance in my opinion, because it's way too similar to like the base Xbox One, and you can get one of those for like £50 now or something like that, and even then I probably wouldn't recommend it because it's just not that great of a gaming experience. Couple this with the fact that it doesn't support DirectX 12.0 or 12.1 at a feature level means it can't even start a lot of games now, let alone run them well. So overall, it's not going to pass as a modern gaming graphics card. But in all fairness, with the games it can actually start, it does look like the driver updates are helping out slightly. So how this would stack up with something like a GTX 760, I'm not too sure, but I suspect in something like Cyberpunk, this might be at least on the heels of the 760. But if we start to move on to the wins of this GPU, it will launch games like F1 23. This will flat out refuse to start on something like a GTX 760 or even a 780 Ti, thanks to the outdated drivers. But this will start it, and it will run it somewhat okay with FSR unbalanced. You will have to set it to very low again and with the upscaler enabled, but you will get more than 60 FPS, which is kind of a win, I suppose. And if you like to win in your competitive games, this GPU will provide a somewhat decent frame rate. Particularly in Fortnite, it ran 200 plus FPS in that game, which was perfectly fine. I'd say that's definitely a pass right there. And Counter-Strike 2, you are getting below sort of 144 FPS, but it's still more than playable, as from what we know, Counter-Strike is more of a CPU dependent game rather than being GPU dependent. And unlike usual, Rainbow Six Siege was kind of a disappointing note today, because this GPU failed to exceed double digits, and ideally in Rainbow Six Siege you want 120 FPS plus, particularly if you've got a high refresh rate monitor. So that's a bit of a disappointment there, but I'd say it's kind of a pass. But compared to other GPUs I've tested, this one is certainly falling behind a bit. And then old games like Halo Master Chief Collection and Skyrim Special Edition are totally fine on this GPU. There's no issues with them at all, particularly in Halo Master Chief Collection, where you're going to be getting crazy frame rates, particularly in Halo Reach on the original preset. So there's no problems there. And if you wanted a kind of a retro gaming PC, don't worry, because this GPU barely consumes any power. I think at most it consumed like 44 watts or something like that. So why it has a 6-pin power connector, I don't know, because through the PCIe slot alone you can draw 75 watts, so that's kind of just pointless, I suppose. Actually, on another note, I don't know why the 6 pins there, because usually on a graphics card it's there, so it's on the wrong side. I don't know what that's about. Maybe it's down to some sort of tracing, because the power delivery is there and it's cheaper to do it that way. I'm not too sure. Even though I don't recommend the GTX 750 Ti in 2024, particularly if you're buying this, don't go out and buy this graphics card. You can just get way better value GPUs for not that much more money. I still think it's kind of a legendary card. That is because back when it launched in 2014, it was sort of the budget option back then, and I really wanted one because This was around the time when I was getting into PC gaming and I had a GT210 at the time. The worst GPU ever launched, and I believe it's still in production for whatever reason. Regardless, I would have taken a 750 Ti over one of those any day of the week, because back in 2013 this GPU was very viable and it basically would have played anything, at least on medium settings with around 60 FPS. So if you were to find a 750 Ti in like a dumpster, or someone giving you one or something along those lines, and you wanted to play esports games and games which came out around 2013, this graphics card is totally viable for that. But there are certainly better options, and if you're playing AAA titles, forget it, this GPU is not going to do it. But if you want to see how a graphics card which can handle AAA titles, there is a video up there, and I'll catch you in the next one. Have a good rest of your day.